Picture Paris in the autumn of 1941. The city is not free. German soldiers walk streets that used to belong to Parisians. Ration cards decide what a family eats. Curfews decide when a man can walk home. And on the outskirts of the city, inside a factory called Billancourt, something illegal is happening. Not sabotage, not weapons smuggling. Something quieter, and in its own way, just as dangerous. Two men are drawing a car. Not just any car, a car nobody gave them permission to build. Under German occupation, the Renault factory was allowed to make one kind of thing: vehicles for the war machine, trucks, military hardware, anything that helped keep the German war effort moving. Passenger cars for ordinary French families, forbidden, flat out forbidden. The man running the factory floor, a German administrator named Wilhelm von Urach, made that rule crystal clear. Here's an odd detail that makes the whole thing even stranger. Von Urach, the German administrator watching over the factory, was actually known as something of a Francophile, a man with genuine affection for France, despite serving the occupying authority. Whether that affection meant he simply chose to look the other way on certain things happening under his own roof is something historians still debate. But either way, a car that should have been impossible to hide somehow stayed hidden, right under the nose of the man whose entire job was to prevent exactly that. So what do you do if you're an engineer who believes France will need a cheap, reliable car the moment the war ends? You don't ask permission, you hide the project in plain sight. That's exactly what Fernand Picard and Charles Edmond Serre did. And what came out of their secrecy would go on to become the first French car in history to sell over 1 million units. This is the story almost nobody tells you about the Renault 4CV, and by the end, you'll understand why some of the bravest engineering in automotive history didn't happen on a racetrack. It happened behind locked doors, in a country that wasn't free. Let's get into it. Here's what almost nobody remembers today. The 4CV wasn't born from ambition, it was born from disguise. Picard and Serre couldn't tell anyone what they were really building, so officially, on paper, their project was something boring, something the Germans wouldn't blink at. They labeled it a new engine for the Juve Quattro, an old Renault model from before the war. Nothing suspicious about an engine upgrade, right? But underneath that paperwork, they weren't just designing an engine, they were designing an entire car around it. A small, rear-engine design with a light monocoque body, the kind of construction that was still fairly new for a mass-market car at the time. Small, simple, cheap enough for a working family to actually afford. This wasn't a luxury project. This was a car meant to put France back on wheels after years of occupation had left the country broke and exhausted. In May of 1941, they showed a mock-up of the engine to Louis Renault himself, the man who built the company from nothing. He looked at it. He approved it. Quietly, the project got a code name, 106E, not a car, a code, because that's what you do when the truth could get you arrested. Now, stop and actually think about what these men were risking. This wasn't corporate rule breaking with a slap on the wrist waiting at the end. This was occupied France. The factory was watched. It was bombed by the Allies specifically because it was producing for the German war effort. Every single day these engineers worked on their secret little car. They were gambling with their own safety, hidden inside a facility crawling with Nazi oversight, using spare hours and borrowed materials to keep a forbidden idea alive. That's the part that gets lost when people talk about classic cars today. They talk about the shape, the engine, the sales numbers. Almost nobody talks about the fact that this car was designed by men who knew exactly what could happen if they got caught. Think about the engineering problem they were actually solving too. France after the war wasn't going to have money for fuel-hungry, complicated cars, so the small team quietly built the 4CV. Around a compact four-cylinder engine, mounted at the rear of the car, driving the rear wheels. That layout kept the floor flat and the cabin surprisingly roomy for something so small. It's the same basic philosophy you'd later see in cars like the Volkswagen Beetle or the Fiat 500. Except this one was being sketched out under Nazi supervision, not in a peaceful design studio. It's worth pointing out something else too. Renault wasn't the only French manufacturer playing this dangerous game. Citroën was quietly developing its own answer to post-war poverty at the same time, a car that would eventually become the 4CV. Both companies were racing toward the same finish line under the same forbidden conditions, without either side fully knowing how close the other one was. The 4CV would end up beating Citroën's car to market by roughly a year. Two competitors, both breaking the same German rule, both betting that the country they loved would need cheap transportation the moment it was free again. But here's the twist nobody sees coming. The war ends. France is liberated in 1944. And instead of a celebration for Louis Renault, the man who ran the company, something darker happens. He's arrested, accused of collaborating with the Germans during the occupation. And soon after, he dies. The official explanation was thin. The circumstances were never fully clarified. The company he spent his life building gets taken out of his family's hands entirely and nationalized by the French state. So, picture this. The secret car project survives 4 years of Nazi occupation. It survives factory bombings. It survives being hidden inside fake paperwork. And now, just as the war ends, the very company meant to build it is thrown into total chaos, with its founder gone and its future completely uncertain. Somebody has to step in. And the man who does has a backstory almost as intense as the car itself. Before I get into who that man was, I want to ask you for something quick. If you're the kind of person who actually appreciates real history, the stuff that never made it into the textbooks, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now. This channel is built entirely around stories like this one, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Alright, back to it. His name was Pierre Lefaucheux, and before he ever set foot inside a Renault boardroom, he was a resistance fighter, operating under a code name, Commandant Gildas. In June of 1944, the Gestapo caught up with him. He was arrested and deported to Buchenwald, one of the most brutal concentration camps in the entire Nazi system. Most stories end right there. His didn't. His wife found out where he was being held, and by several accounts, went directly to negotiate with the Germans holding him for his release. She got him out. He walked away from the machinery of the Holocaust alive, at a moment in history when millions of others never did. By 1945, this same man, fresh out of unimaginable danger, becomes the new head of a nationalized Renault. And one of the very first things placed on his desk is the secret project his own engineers had been hiding for years. Project 106E, the car built in the shadows. He doesn't hesitate. He looks at what Picard and Serre built, and he understands immediately what it could mean for a broken country. He greenlights it. And he doesn't set a modest target either. He wants 300 cars a day rolling off the line by 1949. For a company still recovering from war damage, bombed-out buildings, and a workforce trying to rebuild its own life, that's an aggressive, almost reckless goal. But before this car reaches the public, there's one more chapter almost nobody talks about, and it involves the most famous car designer in Germany. The French government, still negotiating the aftermath of the war, invites Ferdinand Porsche, the man behind the original Volkswagen, to France. Officially, he's there to consult on the new Renault small car. In December of 1945, meetings are arranged. Lefaucheux, the man who survived Buchenwald because of his wife's courage, is now sitting across the table from a designer with deep ties to Nazi Germany's own war machine. Lefaucheux makes sure of one thing above everything else. Porsche has zero real influence on the design. The car is already essentially finished. What happens next depends on which historian you ask, but the documented fact is this. Shortly after those meetings, Porsche is arrested on war crimes, allegations tied to forced labor used at the Volkswagen plant in Germany. He spends the next 20 months locked up in a jail in Dijon. Some historians believe Lefaucheux used his connections to make that happen. Others say it was simply the wheels of justice catching up to him independently. Either way, the timing is hard to ignore, and it tells you everything about the tension boiling under the surface of post-war Europe. Now picture the finish line, October of 1946, the Paris Motor Show. After 5 years of secrecy, danger, a dead founder, a nationalized company, and a diplomatic standoff with one of Germany's most famous engineers, the car finally gets revealed to the public. They call it the Renault 4CV. The reaction is almost instant affection. People start calling it la motte de beurre, the lump of butter, because of its round, soft shape. Others nickname it quatre pattes, four paws, because of the way it sat on the road. It didn't look aggressive, it looked friendly. And after years of occupation and rationing, friendly was exactly what a tired country needed to see. Production actually begins in August of 1947, and Renault sells it with a slogan built for a broke, exhausted country trying to get back on its feet. 4 doors, 4 seats, 4 horsepower, 440,000 francs. Simple. Honest. Affordable. A family of 4 could actually picture themselves in it, which was the entire point. Under the skin, the early cars ran a modest 760 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder engine, good for a top speed of around 90 kilometers an hour, through a simple 3-speed gearbox. Nobody was buying this car to race their neighbor off a stoplight. They were buying it to finally move again, freely, after years of restriction. In 1950, Renault refined the formula with a slightly smaller but more efficient 747 cubic centimeter version of the engine, known as the Venturi, a design so solid it kept powering Renault vehicles for decades afterward. By 1953, the company even introduced a stripped-down, cheaper trim called the 4CV. Service, aimed at buyers who needed something even more basic than the standard car. When the bigger, plusher Dauphine finally arrived in 1956 to take over as Renault's flagship small car, the 4CV didn't just disappear. It kept selling, quietly, as the affordable option underneath its own successor, for 5 more years. And here's the part that turns this from an interesting history footnote into something genuinely remarkable. This little car, built in secret under Nazi occupation, becomes the first French car in history to sell over 1 million units. Production runs all the way until 1961, an incredible 14-year run for a car nobody was even supposed to design in the first place. It even becomes the foundation for Alpine, the sports car brand, whose very first model, the A106, was built directly off the 4CV's underpinnings. That little wartime secret quietly became the seed of French motorsport as we know it. It wasn't just loved on French roads either. The car found buyers across borders. It was assembled in Spain under the Fasa brand, and even in Japan, where Renault built it under license. A car sketched out in fear, inside an occupied country, ended up rolling off assembly lines on the other side of the planet. And it turned out to have some fight in it too. Drivers took the 4CV racing almost from the day it launched, running it in endurance events, and even at the legendary Mille Miglia in Italy. A car designed to be cheap and practical for tired post-war families ended up holding its own on some of the toughest roads in European motorsport. Nobody designs a car like that, expecting it to become a competition legend. But that's exactly what happened. The car's memory didn't fade once production ended either. Renault clearly understood what they had, because decades later, in 1996, on the 50th anniversary of that reveal at the Paris Motor Show, the company built a fully working concept car as a tribute to the original 4CV. That's the kind of honor usually reserved for cars that define a brand, not for a stopgap model somebody threw together to fill a gap in the lineup. Renault knew exactly what this little car represented, and 50 years later, they still wanted the world to remember where it came from. Think about that arc for a second. A car conceived illegally, disguised as an engine upgrade, built by men risking arrest, inherited by a company thrown into chaos, greenlit by a concentration camp survivor, shadowed by a diplomatic scandal involving one of the most controversial engineers of the 20th century, and it becomes the car that literally puts post-war France back on the road, then goes on to race, to travel overseas, and to spawn an entire performance brand. That's not a footnote. That's one of the great untold stories of automotive history. And here's what I think it actually teaches us, beyond the facts and the dates. Sometimes the most important work doesn't happen with permission. It doesn't happen with applause. It happens quietly, under pressure, when the smart move would be to stop, and the brave move is to keep going anyway. Picard and Serre didn't know if they'd survive to see their car on the road. They built it anyway, in stolen hours, under a false name, inside a factory controlled by the very people who would have shut them down instantly if they'd known the truth. And decades later, that decision is still the reason millions of French families got their first taste of real, affordable freedom on four wheels. If your father or grandfather ever talked about the little Renault that got his family moving again after the war, this is the story behind it. A car built out of defiance, delivered by a man who walked out of a concentration camp and finished off with a rival designer landing in prison. It's the kind of history that sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and yet every piece of it happened. For a generation that grew up hearing about occupation, rationing, and rebuilding from their own parents, this isn't just a car story. It's a reminder of what an entire country had to claw its way back from. There was no shortcut out of 1945. There was no clean, easy recovery. There was just people like Picard, Serre, and Lefaucheux refusing to wait for permission to start building the future again. The 4CV wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. It wasn't even particularly powerful. But it put an exhausted nation back on wheels, one small, round, unassuming little car at a time. And it did it because a handful of people were willing to take a real risk when it actually mattered. That's the difference between a footnote and a legacy. Anyone can build something when the rules allow it. It takes a different kind of nerve to build it when the rules say you can't. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do one simple thing before you go. Subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Real history, most people never learned in school. Drop a comment and tell me what part stuck with you the most. Maybe it was his wife walking straight into danger to save him. Maybe it was the secret engine paperwork. Maybe it was Porsche ending up behind bars while the car he supposedly inspired became a legend without him. And if you enjoyed this one, hit like and send it to a friend who'd appreciate it too. Real history deserves to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.